The first person to vanish was Mrs. Chen from 1247 Oleander Drive. Nobody noticed for 3 weeks. That's what haunts me most, not the disappearance itself, but the fact that an 83-year-old woman could simply cease to exist, and not one of us checked on her until the mail carrier complained about her overflowing mailbox. We all saw her house every day. We drove past. It walked our dogs past. It watched its lights go on and off at predictable times. And when those lights stopped following their pattern, when her newspapers started piling up on the porch, when her garden began to wilt from neglect, we just assumed she'd gone to visit family. We assumed wrong. When the police finally did a wellness check, they found her house exactly as she'd left it. Coffee cup on the kitchen table, still half full, a ring of mold floating on the surface. Reading glasses on the arm of her chair. Slippers by the door. TV on playing static because the channel had gone off the air and cycled back to nothing. Everything suggested she'd simply stood up in the middle of her normal routine and walked out the door, leaving her entire life behind. Except Mrs. Chen didn't have family to visit. She'd told me that herself 6 months ago, when I'd helped her carry groceries up her front steps. "Just me in the house," she'd said with a smile that tried to hide the loneliness. Just me. The police classified it as a missing person case. Probably dementia-related wandering, they said. Happens all the time with elderly folks. They'd find her. They didn't. And then 2 weeks later, the Hendersons disappeared from 1302 Maple Court. Welcome back, everyone. I need you to do something for me before we go any further. Look around you right now. Are you home? Do you know where your neighbors are? When's the last time you actually saw them? Not just their cars or their lights, but actually saw them. Because the story I'm about to tell you starts with a simple, terrifying truth. We're all so disconnected that someone could vanish from their home, from their life, from existence itself. And we wouldn't notice until it was far too late. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me about your neighborhood. Do you know your neighbors? Do they know you? Or are you all just strangers living in boxes pretending to be a community? Because in Riverside Estates, that pretense is costing people their lives. Riverside Estates sits in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, one of those planned communities built in the early 2000s, where every house looks vaguely similar, and every street name is some variation of a tree or flower. 43 houses arranged in a perfect grid, each with a 2-car garage and a small yard maintained to HOA standards. The kind of place where people move to feel safe, to raise families, to live quiet lives of structured routine. I'm Detective Sarah Walsh. I've been with the Portland Police Bureau for 12 years, the last 6 in missing persons. I've seen every variation of disappearance you can imagine. Runaways, abductions, people escaping debt, or bad marriages, bodies that turn up months later in rivers or shallow graves. I've learned to read the patterns, to separate the voluntary disappearances from the concerning ones. What was happening in Riverside Estates didn't fit any pattern I knew. When Mrs. Chen vanished, it was barely a blip on my radar. Elderly woman living alone, no signs of foul play. Sad, certainly, but not unusual. When the Hendersons disappeared, Mark Henderson, 41, his wife Jessica, 38, and their 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Noah, 8, that got my attention. Whole families don't just evaporate, but the scene at their house was identical to Mrs. Chen's. Everything in perfect order, nothing missing except the people. Dishes in the sink from breakfast. toys scattered in the living room, both cars in the garage. Emma's phone on her nightstand still charging. It was like they'd been raptured, just taken. The community started to worry. Neighborhood watch meetings went from monthly to weekly. Ring doorbells got installed on every door. Facebook groups exploded with theories: human trafficking, a serial killer, secret witness protection, relocations. Everyone had an explanation, and every explanation was wrong. Because then Thomas Vega disappeared from 1156 Birch Lane. Then the Kowalski family from 1389 Oak Street. Then Sarah Lindstrom, a single mother with a 6-month-old baby from 1423 Willow Road. 5 incidents in 2 months. 11 people gone. And I still had no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence of any crime being committed at all. The FBI got involved. They set up a command center in the community clubhouse, interviewed every resident multiple times, examined every house with forensic teams and cadaver dogs. They found nothing. No DNA evidence, no signs of struggle, no digital footprints, no financial irregularities. It was like these people had simply been erased from reality. I drove to Riverside Estates every day, walking the streets, knocking on doors, asking the same questions over and over. The residents started to recognize me. Some were grateful for the attention. Others grew hostile, blaming the police for failing to protect them. A few started to avoid me, entirely closing their curtains when my unmarked sedan appeared on their street. It was Mrs. Patricia Keating from 1334 Cedar Avenue who first mentioned the pattern. They all lived on the perimeter, she told me over tea in her kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted her cup. Patricia was 72, a retired librarian with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. Look at the addresses. Mrs. Chen on Oleander, that's the eastern edge. The Hendersons on Maple Court, southern edge. Thomas Vega on Birch Lane, western edge. The Kowalskis on Oak Street, northern edge. It's like something is working its way in from the outside. I pulled out my map of Riverside Estates and marked each disappearance with a red dot. Patricia was right. The vanishings formed a ring around the outer edge of the neighborhood, with only Sarah Lindstrom's house on Willow Road, breaking the pattern slightly, though even that was on the second ring of streets just inside the perimeter. Working its way in toward what? I asked. Patricia's teacup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. The center, the old neighborhood, the houses that were here before Riverside Estates was built. I didn't know what she meant. According to all the records, Riverside Estates had been farmland before the development company bought it in 2001. There were no previous structures, no prior neighborhood. "You're new to the area," Patricia said, reading my confusion. "You wouldn't know, but some of us have been in Portland for decades. My husband and I bought our house when Riverside Estates first opened, but we used to drive past this land all the time before the development. There were houses here. Old houses, 7 of them arranged in a circle. They were condemned in the late 1990s. Nobody lived there anymore, hadn't for years. The city tried to tear them down, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were complications." "What kind of complications?" "The demolition crews kept having accidents. Equipment failures, injuries, strange illnesses. After the 3rd worker died, carbon monoxide poisoning from a generator that had been inspected and cleared just that morning, the city gave up. Sealed the houses, instead declared them structurally unsound and sold the land to the development company with the stipulation that the old houses be left alone. I leaned forward. Are you telling me there are condemned houses somewhere in this neighborhood? Not somewhere, Patricia said quietly. Right in the center. The development was built around them. The developer planted trees and installed a fence, created a little nature preserve so they wouldn't have to deal with the demolition problems. Most residents don't even know it's there. It's just a wooded area between the streets, easy to ignore. I stood up, my pulse quickening. Show me. Patricia led me through her backyard and down a footpath that cut between two houses on Sycamore Drive. The path entered a thicket of Douglas firs and overgrown blackberry bushes, the vegetation so dense that the houses on either side quickly disappeared from view. After about 50 yards, the path opened into a clearing, and there they were. 7 houses arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward toward a common area that might once have been a communal garden. They were old 1920s or 1930s construction craftsman style with peeling paint and sagging roofs. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. The front doors of several houses hung open, revealing darkness within. But what struck me most was the silence. No birds sang in these trees. No insects buzzed. Just an oppressive, watchful quiet that made my skin crawl. "This is the center of Riverside Estates," I asked, my voice sounding too loud. Patricia nodded, hanging back at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to approach closer. "The geographical center, yes. The houses form a ring around this spot. Most people never come here. The neighborhood kids used to explore these buildings, but about 5 years ago, they stopped. Said it felt wrong. Said they heard things." "What kinds of things?" "Whispers, footsteps, voices calling their names." Patricia wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm afternoon. "Detective Walsh, I think something lives here. Something that's been here longer than Riverside Estates, longer than these condemned houses, maybe longer than Portland itself. And I think it's taking people. I should have dismissed this as the paranoid ramblings of a frightened elderly woman. I should have focused on rational explanations, human trafficking rings, a methodical serial killer, some criminal enterprise we hadn't uncovered yet. But standing in that clearing, looking at those 7 houses with their broken windows and open doors, I felt what Patricia felt, what those kids must have felt. The sensation of being watched by something that saw you as food. I called my partner, Detective Mike Torres, and told him to meet me at the clearing with a forensics team. While waiting, I documented everything with my phone camera. The 7 houses, their arrangement, the overgrown common area in the center. I zoomed in on one of the open doorways, trying to peer into the darkness within. That's when I saw the shoes. Children's shoes, dozens of pairs lined up neatly just inside the threshold of the nearest house. Sneakers, sandals, rain boots, all small sizes, all arranged with obsessive precision. Some looked new. Others were weathered and old, decades old. My blood went cold. I stepped closer, my hand instinctively going to my service weapon. The shoes were just the beginning. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness inside the house, I could see more objects lining the walls. Backpacks, lunchboxes, toys. And higher up, hanging from hooks like trophies, wallets, purses, keys, watches. Items that belonged to people. Items that should have been in evidence lockers or still with their owners. I recognized one of the backpacks. It was purple with unicorn patches, and I'd seen it in dozens of photos during the investigation. It belonged to Emma Henderson. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, pulling out my phone to call for backup. But when I looked at the screen, I had no signal. Full bars 2 minutes ago in Patricia's backyard, nothing now. I tried anyway, but the call wouldn't connect. That's when I heard the whisper. "Sarah?" My name spoken softly coming from inside the house. A woman's voice familiar but impossible to place. I drew my weapon, training it on the doorway. "Portland Police. Identify yourself." "Sarah, it's me. It's Mom." My mother had been dead for 6 years. Breast cancer stage 4, diagnosed too late. I'd been with her when she died, held her hand, felt her last breath against my cheek. "Come inside, honey. I've missed you so much." Every instinct screamed at me to run. This was wrong, a trap, something using my grief to lure me in. But the voice was perfect. Not similar to my mother's voice, exactly identical down to the slight rasp from years of smoking, the particular way she pronounced my name with the emphasis on the first syllable. "Mom," I whispered, and hated myself for the hope in my voice. "Inside, baby. Come inside and see me. I've been waiting." My feet moved without conscious decision, carrying me toward the threshold. The rational part of my mind was screaming, but it was getting quieter, drowned out by 6 years of unprocessed grief, the desperate wish to see my mother one more time, to apologize for all the things I'd left unsaid. I was 3 feet from the doorway when someone grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. Patricia Keating, all 5 feet and 90 pounds of her, had followed me into the clearing and now pulled me away from the house with surprising strength. "Don't listen, it's not her. It's never who it says it is." The voice from inside the house changed, losing the warmth, becoming something cold and angry. "Let her come, old woman. She wants to come. They all want to come eventually." Patricia dragged me back to the path, and the moment we crossed out of the clearing, my phone signal returned. Full bars, like nothing had happened. I stood there shaking my weapon still drawn, trying to process what had just occurred. Mike arrived 10 minutes later with a forensics team, and I led them back to the clearing. But when we emerged from the path, the scene had changed. The door to the house was closed. When we forced it open, I made sure 3 other officers went in first. The interior was empty. No shoes, no backpacks, no personal effects. Just dust and debris and the smell of rotting wood. The forensics team swept it anyway, but they found nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence that anyone had been inside for years. There were shoes. I insisted to Mike, showing him the photos on my phone. But when I pulled up the images, they showed only the exterior of the houses. The shots I'd taken of the interior of Emma Henderson's backpack, of all those items lined up like a museum exhibit, they were gone. Not deleted, just gone, as if I'd never taken them. "Sarah," Mike said gently, using the tone people use when they think you're losing it. "Maybe you should take a few days off. This case is getting to all of us. You're seeing things that I'm not seeing things. Patricia saw it too. Patricia, tell him what you saw." But Patricia just looked at me with sad, frightened eyes. "I saw you walk toward that house like you were in a trance, detective. I saw you talking to someone, but there was no one there. I got scared and pulled you back. You heard the voice. You heard it calling me. I heard you talking. I didn't hear anyone else. Mike drove me home that night, insisting I was overtired, that the stress of the case was manifesting in auditory hallucinations. He promised we'd increase patrols around the clearing, set up cameras, maybe even post an officer there 24/7. I nodded and agreed, and let him think he'd convinced me. But that night, lying in my apartment 20 minutes from Riverside Estates, I couldn't stop thinking about those shoes, about Emma Henderson's backpack, about my mother's voice so perfect, so real, and about what the voice had said, they all want to come eventually. At 2:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You saw inside. Now it sees you. Be careful, Detective Walsh. The houses remember who enters their clearing. They remember who resists their call. Next time, you might not have an old woman to pull you back. I tried to trace the number, but it didn't exist in any database. The text itself disappeared from my phone 10 minutes later, like it had never been sent at all. That's when I knew this case was going to kill me or drive me insane, or both. 3 days after my experience in the clearing, another family disappeared. The Matsudas from 1278 Dogwood Lane parents, Kenji and Yuki, their teenage son Hiro, and Yuki's elderly mother Akiko. 4 more people gone without a trace, taken from a house that was now only 3 streets from the center. The pattern Patricia had identified was holding. The disappearances were spiraling inward, getting closer to those 7 condemned houses with each incident. I started my own investigation, operating outside official channels. During the day, I worked the case with Mike and the FBI team, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses who had nothing useful to say. At night, I dug into the history of those 7 houses, searching through archives that weren't digitized, talking to Portland old-timers who remembered when that land was still undeveloped. What I found was a story no one wanted to talk about. The 7 houses had been built in 1923 by a group that called themselves the Circle of Unity, a communal living experiment inspired by various utopian movements popular in the early 20th century. 23 people initially living together, sharing resources, trying to create a perfect micro-society. They lasted less than 2 years. In December 1924, the Portland police received a call from a milk delivery man who reported that no one at the commune had collected their deliveries for 3 weeks. When officers arrived, they found the 7 houses exactly as the residents had left them. Food on tables, clothes in closets, books open to pages that would never be turned. 23 people had simply vanished. The case was never solved. The houses sat empty for years, occasionally drawing curious visitors and ghost hunters. In 1967, a group of teenagers broke into one of the houses for a party. Only 3 of the 7 kids who went in came back out. The 3 survivors claimed their friends had walked into the basement and never returned, but search teams found no basement. The houses were single-story structures built on concrete slabs. There was nowhere for 4 teenagers to disappear to. After that, the city condemned the properties, but they couldn't tear them down. Every attempt resulted in accidents, serious injuries, unexplained equipment failures, workers who developed sudden psychiatric problems and had to be institutionalized. Eventually, the city gave up and just erected a fence around the property, declaring it off-limits. In 1998, a homeless encampment formed in the clearing between the houses. 11 people living there trying to stay out of the rain. After 2 months, city officials received complaints about the smell. When they investigated, they found the encampment abandoned. Tents still standing, belongings scattered everywhere, food partially eaten and rotting. 11 more people vanished. That's when the city sold the land to the developers. With one condition, the 7 houses had to remain untouched, and no one could live within 100 feet of them. The developers had agreed, built Riverside Estates around the clearing, planted enough trees and brush to hide the condemned structures, and never mentioned them in any of the marketing materials. Most residents had no idea the houses existed, and for 20 years, everything had been fine, until Mrs. Chen disappeared. I compiled all of this into a report and presented it to Mike and the FBI task force. They listened politely, took notes, and then suggested I take that vacation time we'd discussed. This case was about human predators, they said, not supernatural forces. The historical disappearances were unfortunate coincidences, but they had no bearing on the current investigation. I knew they were wrong, but I also knew I couldn't prove it, not with evidence that disappeared from my phone, not with testimony from witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. So I started watching the clearing myself. I set up a camera in Patricia Keating's backyard. She was the only resident who believed me aimed at the path leading to the 7 houses. For 2 weeks, nothing. Just static footage of an empty trail surrounded by trees. Then on the 15th night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. Someone was walking down the path toward the clearing. A person moving with slow mechanical steps, arms hanging at their sides. The footage was grainy in the infrared, but I could make out enough details: male, average height, wearing pajamas. It was Thomas Vega. Thomas Vega, who had disappeared 6 weeks ago, who we'd searched for with dogs and helicopters and grid searches, who the FBI had classified as likely dead and probably buried somewhere in the vast forests surrounding Portland. He was walking back to the clearing like a sleepwalker, his face blank, his eyes open but unseeing. I called Mike immediately. "I've got Thomas Vega on camera alive walking into the clearing right now. I'm going after him. Sarah, wait for backup. Don't go in there alone." I was already running, Patricia's backyard down the path into the thicket. My flashlight beam cutting through darkness, my service weapon drawn. I could hear footsteps ahead, the soft shuffle of bare feet on dirt. I was gaining on him. Thomas Vega, this is the police, stop." He didn't stop, didn't even slow down. I burst into the clearing and saw him standing in the center in that common area between the 7 houses. He was facing away from me, perfectly still, no longer walking. "Thomas." I approached slowly, keeping my weapon trained on him. "Thomas, I'm Detective Walsh. We've been looking for you. Your family has been worried sick." He turned to face me and I nearly pulled the trigger. His eyes were gone. Not damaged or removed, just absent, as if he'd been born without them. In their place were smooth indentations, like someone had pressed their thumbs into wet clay and left perfect bowl-shaped depressions. But he was looking at me somehow, seeing me without eyes, his head tilting with curiosity. "The houses want more," Thomas said, but his voice was wrong, layered, multiple voices speaking in unison. Some male, some female, some that couldn't possibly be human. "The houses are hungry. The houses remember what it was like to be fed." "Fed what?" I whispered. "People." The circle of unity understood. They built these houses over a thin place, a crack in the world, where something old and vast presses against our reality. They thought they could communicate with it, learn from it, achieve transcendence. They were partially right. It did transcend them. It transcended them right out of existence. Thomas, or what was using Thomas's body, took a step toward me. Behind him, I saw the doors of all 7 houses swing open simultaneously, revealing darkness that seemed somehow thicker than the surrounding night. And from that darkness came whispers, hundreds of voices, all calling names. Sarah, Michael, Patricia, Emma, Jessica. The names of everyone who lived in Riverside Estates, spoken in the voices of their dead loved ones, their lost friends, their forgotten dreams. You can't stop it, Thomas's body said. It's been waiting so long. It was weak after the circle of unity, after it consumed them all at once. It took decades to regain enough strength to reach out again. The teenagers in 1967 gave it a little. The homeless people in 1998 gave it more. Now it's strong enough to harvest regularly. One person at a time at first, then families, and soon it will take everyone in Riverside Estates at once. And when it does, it will be strong enough to reach farther, to the next neighborhood, to the next town, to the next city. Where are they? I demanded. Where are the people it took? Thomas's body smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. Inside, where they've always been, where the circle of unity has been for 100 years, where I am now. We're all inside Detective, living in the spaces between the walls, in the gaps between moments. We're the houses now. We're part of it. And soon, you will be too. He took another step forward, and the ground beneath him rippled like water. His feet began to sink into soil that had suddenly become liquid, pulling him down. He didn't struggle, didn't cry out, just kept smiling as he descended into the earth inch by inch until the ground swallowed him completely and sealed over as if he'd never been there at all. I ran back down the path, back to Patricia's yard, back to my car. My hands shook so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away from Riverside Estates, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw them figures standing in every doorway of every house on the perimeter streets. Silent, watching, waiting. When I tried to review the camera footage from Patricia's backyard, the file was corrupted. Nothing but digital snow and occasional flashes of faces in the static dozens of faces, all screaming without sound. The FBI ordered a mandatory evacuation of Riverside Estates 3 days later. After my report carefully edited to remove any mention of supernatural elements, and instead focus on potential environmental hazards like carbon monoxide or toxic mold, causing mass hallucinations, federal environmental teams descended on the neighborhood. They were going to condemn the entire development, relocate everyone, and tear it all down, including the 7 houses. 38 residents remained in Riverside Estates. 5 families had already fled on their own, unwilling to wait for official action. The FBI gave everyone 48 hours to pack essentials and arrange temporary housing. Most complied willingly. Who wanted to stay in a neighborhood where 11 people had vanished without a trace, but Patricia Keating refused to leave? When Mike and I went to her house to insist, we found her sitting in her kitchen, drinking tea, completely calm. "I'm not going," she said simply. "Patricia, you don't have a choice. This is a federal order. I've lived in this house for 23 years. I know what's out there in those woods. I've felt it watching me, calling to me, trying to lure me in. But I also know something you don't. It can't take you if you don't go to it willingly. Every person who disappeared walked into that clearing of their own accord. Even if they were in a trance, even if they were manipulated, they still took those steps themselves. The houses can't reach out beyond their circle. They can only call. They can only tempt. That's not a risk we can let you take. I'm an old woman. I have maybe 5 years left if I'm lucky. I'm not going to spend them afraid running from something that's been my neighbor for 2 decades without ever successfully taking me." She smiled. "Besides, someone needs to stay. Someone needs to watch. Because if you tear down those houses without understanding what you're dealing with, you might release something far worse than what's already here." She was right, though I wouldn't admit it at the time. The containment theory made sense. The 7 houses formed a boundary, a prison of sorts, keeping whatever existed in that thin place from spreading. Destroying them might break that containment. But the FBI wasn't interested in theories about supernatural prisons. They had bulldozers scheduled to arrive in 72 hours. I spent those 72 hours trying to find an alternative. I consulted with paranormal investigators, quietly, secretly using burner phones, so the FBI wouldn't find out and fire me. Most of them were charlatans, but a few understood what I was describing. They used terms like genius loci and egregore and parasitic dimensional entity. They all agreed on one thing: you couldn't kill it, not in any conventional sense, but you might be able to starve it. It feeds on people. One researcher told me an old woman in Seattle who specialized in Pacific Northwest supernatural phenomena. But more specifically, it feeds on connection, on community, on the bonds between people living in close proximity. The circle of unity gave it a feast because they were so interconnected, so intertwined in each other's lives. Modern suburbs are almost as good people living close together, but pretending not to see each other, that tension between proximity and isolation. It's like a perfect growing medium. So how do we stop it? You can't, but you can contain it. Seal the houses completely, not demolish them, seal them. No doors, no windows, no openings. Trap it inside its own prison. Then make sure no one lives nearby. No community within its reach. Given enough time without feeding centuries, maybe it will dormant again. I brought this theory to the FBI. They laughed me out of the room. Environmental contamination was the only explanation they'd accept. Demolition would proceed as scheduled. The night before the bulldozers arrived, I went back to Riverside Estates. The neighborhood was empty now, except for Patricia sitting in her kitchen waiting. And the figures in the doorways, more of them now, dozens, crowding each entrance, pressing against the glass, all wearing the faces of missing people. I walked to the clearing one last time. The 7 houses sat in their circle waiting, patient. The doors were all open, revealing that impossible darkness within. And from that darkness, my mother's voice called out one more time. "Sarah, honey, come inside. Don't you want to see me?" "I know you're not her," I said to the darkness. "I know what you are." "Do you?" The voice changed, became something ancient and vast. "You know nothing. You've seen the barest edge of what we are. We existed before humans built their first shelter. We existed when your ancestors worshipped us as gods. We are the space between walls, the hollow beneath floors, the emptiness in abandoned places. We are every house that feels wrong, every room that's colder than it should be, every door that opens when it should be closed. We are the price of civilization. The more you build, the more you gather, the more space you make for us. Then why do you need to take people if you're so powerful? Why do you hunt? Because we're hungry. We're always hungry. Your presence feeds us, your fear sustains us, but nothing satisfies like consuming a life completely. And this place, these 7 houses, they're not a prison, they're a throat. A connection between your world and ours. The circle of unity built them as a temple, thinking they'd receive wisdom. Instead, they opened a door. And now we're coming through one person at a time until we're strong enough to open it completely. The FBI is going to tear you down tomorrow. The laughter that came from those 7 houses made the trees shake. Birds erupted from the forest, fleeing even in the dead of night. Let them try. Every brick they remove, every wall they knock down, every board they tear away, it all makes the door wider. They think they're destroying us. They're helping us break free. I realized the truth then. The thing in the clearing was right. Demolition would release it. Spread it, let it infect the entire city. But sealing it, entombing it in concrete and steel might work. Might trap it long enough for it to weaken. I called every contact I had. Made promises I couldn't keep, pulled favors I didn't have, lied to people I respected. By dawn, I had what I needed, a concrete company willing to work immediately, no questions asked, and enough money borrowed against my entire future to pay for it. The FBI arrived at 8 a.m. with their bulldozers. They found the 7 houses completely encased in concrete. I'd had the crew work through the night, pumping concrete into every opening, sealing every door and window, covering the structures completely until they were nothing but gray monoliths. The FBI agent in charge was furious. Threatened me with obstruction, destruction of evidence, federal charges. But before they could do anything, the concrete began to crack. Not breaking apart, cracking like something inside was pressing outward. The monoliths I'd created started to bulge, to warp, as the thing trapped inside tested its new prison. Everyone backed away, watching in horror as the concrete creaked and groaned. Then Patricia Keating walked out of her house carrying a container of salt. "What are you doing?" I shouted at her. "Something my grandmother taught me," she said calmly. She walked to the first concrete monolith and began pouring salt around its base, moving in a circle, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. She repeated the process for all 7 structures, creating 7 circles of salt. The moment she completed the 7th circle, the cracking stopped. The concrete settled. And from within those sealed tombs came a scream of rage so loud and terrible that every window in Riverside Estates shattered simultaneously. Then, silence. Patricia turned to me, looking suddenly exhausted. "That will hold it. Maybe for decades, maybe for centuries. But you need to make sure no one builds here again. No one lives here. This needs to be empty land, forgotten land." "How did you know?" "My grandmother was from the old country. She knew things, taught me things before she died." Patricia smiled sadly. "I stayed because I knew this would happen. knew you'd try to help, knew you'd need someone who understood. The FBI investigation concluded 3 months later. Official cause of disappearances, environmental contamination leading to mass neurological damage and subsequent deaths. The bodies were never recovered because they'd been dissolved by the toxic conditions. Riverside Estates was demolished everything except the 7 concrete monoliths, which were declared too structurally unstable to remove safely. The land was fenced off, declared a Superfund site, and everyone moved on. Except me. I resigned from the Portland Police Bureau, took a job as a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases. The official reason was burnout. The real reason was that I couldn't stop thinking about what Patricia's grandmother had known about what other old women in other places might know about things that live in the spaces between walls. I started investigating similar cases across the country. Neighborhoods where people vanished without trace. Towns with buildings that couldn't be demolished. Communities built on land where something wrong had happened long ago. There were more than I'd expected. Dozens, maybe hundreds. In Nevada, an apartment complex built over an abandoned silver mine where 12 miners had disappeared in 1887. 6 tenants vanished in 3 years before the building was condemned. In Massachusetts, a housing development built around a colonial-era plague house that the developers had been forbidden to demolish. 11 disappearances in 5 years. In Texas, a retirement community constructed over land where a cult had performed mass suicide in 1974. 17 residents gone without a trace. The pattern was always the same old structures previous disappearances attempted demolition that failed mysteriously new construction around the site, and then people starting to vanish again. Like Riverside Estates, like those 7 houses, there were thin places all over America where something hungry pressed against our world and waited for people to get close enough to take. I documented everything, compiled a database, tried to warn people. No one listened. The cases were too disparate, too weird, too easy to explain away with conventional crime or mental illness or bad luck. I was the crazy ex-cop who'd lost it during a tough case, seeing patterns that weren't there. But I kept investigating, kept traveling to these places, kept trying to understand the rules that governed what lived in the thin places, and slowly I started to figure it out. They couldn't leave their original site. Whatever anchored them, the original structure, the original tragedy, they were bound to that location. They could only reach as far as their influence extended, usually a few hundred yards at most. That's why the disappearances in Riverside Estates had followed a spiral pattern working inward from the perimeter. The thing in the 7 houses could only reach so far. They needed people to come to them willingly, even if that willingness was manufactured through manipulation or mind control. That's why they used the voices of loved ones, created irresistible lures. Physical force didn't work. They needed invitation, needed the victim to take those final steps into their domain. And they were patient, eternally patient. They could wait decades between feedings, could go dormant for generations, if necessary. Time meant nothing to them. I returned to Riverside Estates a year after the evacuation. The fence was still up, covered with warning signs about environmental hazards. The houses had all been demolished, their foundations torn up the streets, broken apart. Nature was slowly reclaiming the land, grass growing through asphalt cracks, blackberry bushes spreading over former lawns. But in the center, the 7 concrete monoliths remained. They were covered in graffiti, now tags from teenagers who'd climbed the fence on dares. I could still see Patricia's salt circles faintly marked in the dirt around each structure, though weather had partially erased them. I did-inched one of the monoliths, pressing my palm against the concrete. It was cold, far colder than the surrounding air temperature should allow. And if I concentrated, I could feel something, a vibration, like a heartbeat coming from deep within. Still alive, still hungry, still waiting. I found Patricia Keating's obituary 6 months after my return to Riverside Estates. Natural causes died peacefully in her sleep in her new apartment in downtown Portland. The funeral was small. She'd outlived most of her friends and had no family. I was one of only 7 people in attendance. Her lawyer contacted me 3 days later. Patricia had left me something in her will, a journal and a letter. The letter was brief. Dear Detective Walsh, if you're reading this, I've finally moved on to whatever comes next. I hope it's peaceful. I hope there are no thin places where I'm going. The journal belonged to my grandmother. She was one of the 23 original members of the Circle of Unity. She survived because she left 3 days before they all vanished. Something told her to leave an instinct, a warning from ancestors, I never knew which. But she knew what happened to the others. She saw it in her dreams for decades afterward. I've left you the journal because you're trying to stop these things from taking more people. That's noble. That's good. But you need to understand something first. You can't stop them. You can only delay them. They're part of the world now, woven into the fabric of civilization itself. Every time we build a community, every time we gather people together in one place, we risk creating a thin place if the conditions are right. The journal explains more. My grandmother spent her life studying this phenomenon, trying to understand it. Maybe her research will help you. Maybe it won't. But at least you'll know what you're really fighting. Good luck, detective. And remember, don't go into the clearing. With respect, Patricia Keating. I opened the journal that night with a cup of coffee and a sense of dread. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1923, and written in elegant script. Today we broke ground on our new community. 7 houses arranged in a circle, symbolizing unity and equality. We've chosen this location carefully. Mr. Blackwood insists the energy here is potent, that the veil is thin, that we'll be able to commune with forces beyond human understanding. I'm less certain, but Theodore is so enthusiastic, and I do so want to believe. The entries continued through 1923 and into 1924. They described the construction of the houses, the move-in of all 23 members, their attempts to create a perfect society based on shared resources and communal living. But they also described other things. Strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, voices in the night, members reporting dreams where they saw vast spaces between walls, dimensions that existed in the gaps between reality. Mr. Blackwood, the community's spiritual leader, encouraged these experiences. He believed they were achieving their goal of transcendence, of touching something beyond the human realm. He held ceremonies in the common area between the 7 houses, trying to strengthen their connection to what he called the presence. Patricia's grandmother, her name was Catherine, grew increasingly disturbed. She wrote about how members started to change, to speak in strange cadences, to stare at walls for hours. She described how the community became obsessed with feeding the presence, though they couldn't articulate what that meant. The final entry, dated December 3rd, 1924, made my blood run cold. I'm leaving tonight. Mr. Blackwood has announced that tomorrow we will achieve final unity, that the presence has grown strong enough to fully merge with us, to take us all into itself, to make us part of the space between walls. He says we'll be immortal there, living forever in the gaps of reality. The others are excited. Theodore says he can already feel himself dissolving, becoming less solid. Susan claims she can walk through walls if she concentrates hard enough. Michael says he doesn't need to eat anymore, that the presence sustains him. But I've been having nightmares. In them, I see my friends trapped in darkness, pressed between walls that don't exist in normal space, screaming silently for eternity, while something vast and hungry slowly digests them. I can't stay. I won't let that happen to me. Tonight, while they're all sleeping, I'm taking what I can carry and leaving. God forgive me for abandoning them. But I think whatever Mr. Blackwood has contacted isn't offering transcendence. It's offering consumption. If anyone reads this, know that we brought this on ourselves. We invited it in. We fed it with our presence, our belief, our willingness to dissolve into something greater. We made this thin place. We created the door. And I don't think we can ever close it again. The journal entries continued beyond December 1924, but they were Catherine's records of similar phenomena across the country. She'd spent decades traveling, documenting, trying to find other thin places and understand what created them. Her research filled 300 pages, all written in that same elegant script. And on the last page, dated just weeks before her death in 1982, she'd written one final note: I've finally understood. The thin places aren't random. They're not accidents. They're symptoms. Humanity builds communities because we're social creatures. We gather, we connect, we create density of population. But that gathering creates something else, spaces. The gaps between people who live close together but don't really know each other. The emptiness in apartment buildings where hundreds live but no one speaks. The hollow feeling in suburbs where everyone has their own house, their own life, completely separate from their neighbors. That emptiness is what they feed on. That's what makes the places thin. We create the hunger by the way we live. I don't know how to fix it. Maybe we can't. Maybe this is the price of civilization, these predatory entities that thrive in the gaps we create between ourselves. All I know is that they're spreading, slowly, patiently waiting for the right conditions. And someday, there will be so many thin places, so many of these entities, that there won't be any safe communities left. We did this to ourselves. And I don't think we can undo it. I closed the journal and looked around my apartment. I lived alone in a building with 60 units. I'd been here 3 years and couldn't name a single neighbor. Didn't know who lived next door, didn't know who walked the hallways, didn't know who shared my walls. We were all just strangers in boxes living inches apart but completely separate. Creating emptiness, creating space for something to move into. I walked to my window and looked out at Portland spread below me. Thousands of buildings, hundreds of thousands of people, all living in that same disconnected proximity. How many thin places existed in the city? How many things lived in the gaps between walls waiting to be fed? My phone buzzed. A news alert about a missing family in Seattle. Then another about unexplained disappearances in a San Francisco apartment complex. Then a third about a neighborhood in Austin where people had started vanishing. It was spreading, just like Catherine had predicted. And I realized something that made my hands shake. I couldn't stop it. Patricia had been right. Catherine had been right. You can't kill these things, can't destroy them, can only delay them, contain them, try to keep them from spreading faster. But they would spread anyway, patiently, inevitably, because we kept building the conditions that nourished them. We kept creating communities of strangers, gathering people in dense proximity, while maintaining emotional distance, manufacturing exactly the kind of emptiness they thrived on. I started to type up a warning, a report, something to document what I'd learned. But as I typed, I watched the words delete themselves letter by letter, as if invisible hands were pressing backspace on my keyboard. My screen flickered. In the reflection, I saw something standing behind me in my apartment. Something tall and thin, with too many joints, wearing a face I recognized as mine, but not quite right. I spun around. My apartment was empty, but when I looked back at my computer screen, there was a message I hadn't typed. "Hello, Sarah. We've been waiting for you to understand. You've seen so many of us, traveled to so many thin places, spent so much time near our territory. Did you really think that wouldn't leave a mark, that we wouldn't notice, that we wouldn't follow you home?" I looked around my apartment again, at the walls I'd never questioned, at the spaces between rooms, at the closet that was always slightly colder than the rest of the apartment, at the corner behind my couch, where shadows seemed just a bit deeper than they should be. And I realized I was already inside. I'd been inside for months, maybe longer, ever since that first day at Riverside Estates, when I'd walked into that clearing and heard my mother's voice. I'd brought something back with me, something that had been patiently hollowing out my apartment, my life making room for itself. The message on my screen changed. "The thing about thin places, Sarah, is that they're contagious. You can't study us without becoming us. You can't get close without bringing us home. And now your apartment is a thin place too, and soon so will your neighbors' apartments, then the whole building, then the whole block. We spread through proximity and isolation, the same conditions that created us in the first place. Thank you for helping us grow." I tried to stand up to run to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I looked down and saw why my feet were sinking into the floor, the carpet becoming liquid, pulling me down into a darkness that shouldn't exist beneath a third-floor apartment. My phone buzzed again. Multiple news alerts, all at once, all variations on the same theme. Mass disappearances reported in Portland. Entire apartment building. Evacuated residents missing, police investigating unexplained vanishings in multiple locations. I had time for one final thought before the floor swallowed me completely. How many other people like me had there been over the years? How many investigators, researchers, curious souls who'd gotten too close to the thin places and carried the infection back to their own communities? How many of these disappearances were my fault? The darkness closed over my head. And in that darkness, I heard voices, hundreds of voices, thousands. All the people who'd been taken by the thin places over decades, over centuries, all pressed together in the spaces between walls, in the gaps between reality. and now I was one of them. Somewhere far above in the world I'd left behind my apartment would be found empty. Phone still on my desk, coffee still warm. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where I'd gone. Another missing person case that would never be solved. Another file that would be closed after the mandatory investigation period. Another name added to the statistics. And somewhere in that same world, the thin places were growing, spreading, consuming, patient and hungry and inevitable, because we'd created them and we couldn't stop. The end, or the beginning.